Hello, my name is Michael Byers. I am the chair of the Salt Spring Forum, and I'm very pleased to bring you a fascinating discussion between Jim Stanford and Gary Holman. Dr. Stanford is the director of the Center for the Future of Work. Before that, he was the chief economist for Unifor, Canada's largest private sector union. And Gary Holman is the Salt Spring Director for the Capital Regional District and the former MLA for Saanich North and the Islands. Now, one thing I should say is that we had a technical problem while filming this event, and due to a corrupted memory card, we don't have the high-definition version of Gary Holman. But because we believe that substance is more important than style, we decided to give you this event anyway. So please focus on what Gary Holman says, and you can look as long as you want at Jim Stanford. Thank you very much, and enjoy the next 45 minutes.
Well, Jim, great to meet you. And I wanted to get you to just describe in general terms your view about the future of work, and whether that view, what are the sort of the driving factors behind that view, and is your view, as with other things economic, would you say it's different from, say, conventional wisdom, or to label things, the neoliberal view of the world?
Sure, Gary, thanks. So glad to join you in your forum. I take a kind of a very broad, almost generic approach to defining and understanding work. What do we actually mean by work? And I think that's important to start there, because otherwise you get immediately sucked into, I think, all kinds of hype about, supposed changes in work, and even those who argue that work is somehow going to disappear. It's not possible. And if you think of work in sort of concrete, simple terms, it's obvious. Work means the productive human activity of people like you and me who use our brains and our brawn. Our brains, our ability to think and conceive and conceptualize and manipulate symbols and images, and our brawn, our capacity to do actual physical labor, to move things. We use those capacities to produce the goods and services that we need in order to survive. And human beings have always had to work. That's the reality. Ever since we descended from the trees in East Africa, 200,000 years ago or however long, we've had to use our brains and brawn in order to interact with the natural environment, produce the goods and services that are essential to our survival. And then, when we were able to, more than survival, so to get to the better things of life, like comfort and entertainment and education and care. And that's what drives our standard of living. It also is the sort of central element that ties together human communities. So the fact that we cooperate in our work, that people do different tasks and that we work together, is what makes us human, frankly. And that goes completely against the grain of sort of traditional neoliberal economics, which somehow pretends that we're all individual greedy agents out for ourselves and ourselves alone. That's not remotely a description of humanity. And in fact, it is our unique social intelligence and our ability to communicate and cooperate. We're the only species on the planet where unrelated individuals cooperate on complex tasks. And so we are innately cooperative in that sense. So we've always worked. We're always going to have to work. We've always used tools in work. You didn't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out how to use simple stone tools and other implements, and build structures that themselves are tools. A home ultimately is a tool. And in fact, humans aren't alone in that. There's lots of animals who use tools to make their work more productive. A chimpanzee using a stick to get termites out of a log, or a beaver, the great Canadian animal, building a dam in order to catch fish. Those are tools as well. So there's nothing new about work, nothing new about using tools. We've always used tools in order to make our work more productive and effective, and to be able to produce things that we couldn't do with our bare hands. And tools have always changed, and the process of changing tools has always introduced new opportunities, but also new threats into how we work. And how the benefits of work are divided up amongst our society. So in a way, I'm just completely dubious of all of the hype about, accelerating technological change, automation, humans being replaced by machines, and the future of work being turned upside down. I don't see that happening at all. In fact, Gary, in the economic evidence today, it seems that technology is slowing down, not speeding up. If we measure it by how much machinery we use in our day-to-day lives, how much businesses and employers invest in machinery and equipment and technology, it's falling, not rising. Even the expansion of relatively menial, low productivity and unfortunately low paid jobs, which use very simple tools. The greatest irony of all, what is considered the technological frontier of the future of work? Gig jobs, people riding bikes to deliver fast food, or rideshare drivers in a car driving a person from point A to point B. These are some of the most low-tech, undervalued, unproductive tasks you can imagine, and yet this is what we see as the future of work. I don't think so. So I am concerned about technology and how it's changing, to be sure. I'm more concerned about how it changes the relationships between people in the world of work than how it actually changes the productive process. I'm still an optimist in one level in that I think most forms of new technology could make our work more efficient and open up the possibility of some combination of a higher standard of living in material terms, plus more leisure time with which to enjoy those things. That's the part that's fallen off the agenda in recent decades. But I do think we, in a way, have to get pragmatic and down to earth about work. I think the future of work is going to look a lot like the past of work. That's the irony.
Well, when you're forecasting, quite often you do use historical trends, at least for the starting point, right? And what's this COVID pandemic experience, which is unprecedented, certainly in our lifetime. Do you think that's driving some of the mythology that you're describing around the future of work? I mean, this very unique kind of circumstance where people now are communicating and working remotely. Do you think this unique situation is driving some of that future of work that you think is ignoring the nature of humans and ignoring past trends?
Well, I think most of that kind of hype that I was critiquing earlier, the discourse about robots coming to take our jobs and either, we're all going to have so much leisure time we won't know what to do with it, or the dystopian version of that, which is we'll all be unemployed and there'll just be a small elite that owns all the robots. Those discourses, that kind of hype was already there well before the pandemic. But I do think the pandemic may have sort of accelerated some of that. And I think the pandemic has certainly, and more, I think, legitimately shone a light on some of the problems in how we were organizing work before the pandemic hit. Let me give you a good example. We've been studying for some years now the phenomenon of precarious work. The idea that a sort of traditional standard, more or less stable employment relationship where somebody had a job, they knew how many hours they would be working, they could predict their income, and there were certain benefits and protections that came with that job. That has been on the way out for some years. And today, probably less than half of employed Canadians have that sort of traditional standard job with benefits. What it's being replaced with is various forms of insecure or flexible or contingent work, where employers hire people to work with their brains and brawn, just as always. The work is still going on, but the terms and conditions of that work are very different. They're hired on a sort of on-demand basis when they're needed. They're disposed of relatively costlessly when they're not needed. More often than not these days, they're paid a sort of a piecework compensation, not so much by the hour or the week, often by the specific task or the specific job that they're doing. And the benefits of that for employers are that the risk and cost of the normal fluctuations in demand that you see in a capitalist economy, those risks are shifted onto the backs of the workers. They get paid when they're needed and they don't get paid when they're not needed. The downside, of course, from the worker's perspective is just a huge degree of insecurity and inability to predict what your income is going to be. inability to be confident about your future income, which holds back all kinds of things. You can't get a mortgage to buy a house if you don't have a regular income, and support your family and prepare for contingencies and save for retirement. So that phenomenon was already there, very well established. In fact, for the last 20 years, really, employers have been given the freedom and the opportunity to expand their use of insecure work. The pandemic, however, has shone a very harsh spotlight on the downsides of the precarious work staffing model in all kinds of ways. Number one, if you're in a precarious job, guess what? You don't have benefits. That means you don't get sick pay. So lo and behold, Dr. Bonnie Henry or whoever else is saying, if you came in contact with someone who might have COVID, stay home for 2 weeks. Are you kidding me? Okay, the vast majority of people in precarious situations don't have the economic opportunity to stay home for 2 weeks. Yeah. So right there, we see how precarious work is threatening the health of our society, not just precarious workers in those jobs. Another example is looking at the catastrophe that unfolded in long-term care homes and some other industries where the staffing model had become so dependent on precarious work models that people involved were making the decision to try to combine 2 or 3 or 4 different part-time jobs in different locations because that was the only way they could get enough hours and money to support themselves. Well, in a pandemic, guess what? Those people are actually taking the virus from one workplace to another. And in a long-term care setting, it's deadly. So that is exactly what caused the catastrophe that we saw in Quebec and Ontario with hundreds, thousands of deaths. Like, we're not talking about ideology here. We're talking about human lives now. Yeah. Fortunately, in BC, the government moved very quickly to stop that practice. Right. Early in the first wave of the pandemic, they implemented a single site staffing rule for long-term care so that you had to offer your workers, with government support, full-time hours at a union wage. So that helped. But there's lots of ways in which precarious work has posed real threats, economic threats and health threats to all of society. And I'm hopeful, I'm determined, that we can highlight those fissures in our work world, the longstanding fissures and problems and inequities in our work world, and say, look, we should have fixed these ages ago, but in the wake of the pandemic, we really have to fix them. So in my research, I've developed a list of 10 sort of key ways that we think work must be changed for good after the pandemic, and for good in both senses of the word, for better, but also permanently.
So those changes, many of them would involve government policy, government intervention of some kind, which is, I mean, that's if you were going to distinguish yourself and more liberal economists, it would be in large part around the role of government. It does seem that the COVID experience has highlighted the importance of government, the crucial importance of government. The deficits that we're running now are would be inconceivable in any other time. But we seem to be able to accept it quite well. You don't hear conservative commentators really complaining about the deficit. They accept it as a necessity and are accepting the fact that government has to play a key role here. So would you say that, like, your view of the future of work, there are historical trends which have already been underway and being accentuated by the pandemic, but it's another example where your view of the world, where we need to have active governments, it seems to me that this issue does sort of bring up that key difference between you and, say, other economists, which is around the importance of government in society, and your 10 issues that you think need to be changed or acted on, and give us some examples. But I would assume that many of them will involve government intervention, policy, regulations, that kind of thing.
Oh, certainly. Now, there's a traditional stereotype that conservatives want small government and progressives want big government. And that stereotype is wrong, actually. We've got to dig a bit deeper below that. Conservatives don't want to get rid of government. Capitalism would have never come about if it weren't for the supporting role that government has played all the way through. And so they want government. They want strong government. They want big government in a certain sense, but they just want government to do, a kind of certain one-sided type of activity. They want government to do things that help business, including supporting business during tough times, providing infrastructure that allows businesses to operate, paying for training a skilled workforce, providing, all kinds of tax incentives and co-investments to facilitate business investment and accumulation. And, when times get tough, bailing out the business sector completely. So That's happened time and time again. It happened in the 2008-2009 financial crisis. Our federal government, under the well-known socialist Stephen Harper, provided $220 billion of financial support to the banking system at that moment to save them. Now, of course, we're in an even deeper crisis, and of course, government has intervened. Now, this time we're getting a somewhat more balanced form of intervention, and the federal government, to its credit, has delivered hugely in terms of supports for Canadians, not just for Canadian businesses. So the income supports, the CERB, the improvements in the EI system, and some of the other measures have been absolutely vital to helping us get through this. And I do believe that we're going to see a permanent increase in the size of the public sector and the scope of the public sector. I think that's going to be necessary for economic reasons. The reality is the private sector activity, especially business investment, is not just going to snap back after this pandemic. It was not strong to start with, and now it's been devastated by the lack of confidence and the uncertainty and the lost cash flow that has been experienced through the pandemic. So I think we're going to need government to play a bigger role for some years to come. I've likened it to a kind of reconstruction after a war. And we actually did this in Canada after World War II. We had a deliberate national post-war reconstruction strategy. C.D. Howe, who'd been the wartime planning minister, then became the post-war reconstruction minister. And they did all kinds of things, including physical infrastructure, Trans-Canada highways and St. Lawrence seaways and so on, but also social infrastructure, the expansion of public education and healthcare and everything else. And we had decades of prosperity as the footprint of government expanded. That got rolled back to a certain degree during the neoliberal era. And I think that both economically and politically, the conditions are there to restore public sector activity, including public service delivery, including public enterprise in different ways. If private capital accumulation is not going to be sufficient to get the macroeconomic ball rolling, then we're going to need government to do more things, not just infrastructure and not just income supports, but actually get down and dirty with crown corporations and other forms of public or social investment to create work and stimulate economic activity. So we have already seen a significant increase in public sector employment as a share of total employment during the pandemic. And I think that's going to stick. I think we're going to see more of that, particularly if we're able to push government to move ahead with some of the things that they've been talking about. National childcare system, for example, which was one of the proposals in the throne speech. We've estimated the economic impacts of that as being enormous, 200,000 plus jobs in the childcare sector itself, and then hundreds of thousands of more jobs related to it, including through improved female labor force participation. So that's just one example of the sorts of ways that I think expanding government moving forward will lead to, facilitate reconstruction and actually build back better, as the slogan says.
So the traditional right-wing political strategy of campaigning from the left and governing from the right, maybe actually, and those throne speeches you mentioned about pharmacare and daycare, and there have been a number of throne speeches promising those kinds of things. At this point, it looks like governments are going to have to follow through with that. It's a necessity at this point.
Well, it's not a foregone conclusion, Gary, and you're quite right to point out that fine words have been issued in the past. But I do think that, there's the sort of coming together. We've even got business leaders speaking in favor of the childcare thing. And it will happen if we make it happen. And I do think that progressives have a chance to kind of mobilize and build pressure and assemble the coalition that would allow this to happen. But make no mistake, the other side is gearing up their arguments. You mentioned earlier, Gary, that the right wing has been kind of silent on the issues of debt and deficit, the usual hysteria that you'd hear from them about, oh my God, there's a deficit we have to cut.
Right.
And they have been relatively silent in the first months of the pandemic, but they're not going to be silent for long. In fact, we're already hearing some of them gearing up. The C.D. Howe Institute, conservative think tank, even though C.D. Howe, who I just spoke about, was of a different brand, the C.D. Howe Institute today already out there saying the government's going spendthrift. We need a fiscal anchor, they call it, in order to restrain spending. They don't want to see a Build Back Better agenda. They just want to see a government, get through the immediate crisis and then go back to business as usual.
Right.
And you're going to see, of course, from the political right, Pierre Poilievre and the other populists in the Conservatives going nuts about government indebtedness and so on. So we are going to have to gear up on the progressive side of things to confront and defeat those arguments. And, that'll come from research and mobilizing the information, but ultimately mobilizing people. And it's when we push governments strongly enough to force them to move on these issues that will enhance our standard of living. That's when we'll win them.
So, speaking of things that never change, including the need for humans to work, the political imperative for progressives doesn't change either. There's still going to be a struggle, still going to be a need to fight for these kinds of measures, these kinds of policies. I want to get to a couple of questions that forum members have been asking. Jim, and you've covered some of them already, and I'm going to jump around a little bit, but is there a climate connection, a climate implication? You think of the various crises that we're facing. There's yet another one. Is there a climate implication or connection with the future of work as far as you're concerned, just at a really simplistic level? Yeah, the conventional wisdom, everybody's going to be working at home doing what we're doing, so that'll cut down on car travel, which is a good thing. Is there a connection there in your view between those issues?
Oh, certainly. There has to be. Everything that we do going forward has to have climate at the center of it. The scientific evidence is overwhelming in that regard, and there's huge opportunities there as well as challenges. The pandemic has certainly highlighted the time-limited nature of the fossil fuel industry. It is glaring headlines right now that fossil fuel industry is on its way out, and that the fossil fuel industry will never again serve as an engine of growth in Canada's economy. That became immediately clear. The pressure was already building on the fossil fuel sector. You saw a downturn in world demand. You saw incredible declines in the cost of renewable energy sources. You saw leading fossil fuel companies like BP and Shell actually announcing, we're getting out of this business. Right. We're going to go find some other way to make money. So the signs were already there, but you still had, the oil industry lobbyists and Jason Kenney and his war room trying to tilt against windmills and pretend that it wasn't happening. But the impact of the pandemic on world demand, and then that period of time, remember, when Canadian oil was selling for less than zero, just highlighted for everyone that this is an industry that's on the way out, and there's no point trying to stop it. You might as well say, this is happening, let's try and get ahead of that change. And we can absolutely get ahead of that change with investments in renewables and phased transitions and big spending on alternative industries to hire people, including in those handful of rural communities in Canada that really do depend on fossil fuel jobs. In the rest of the country, it's very small share of the total labor market, and we can facilitate that transition easily. In some of those fossil fuel dependent regions, it's a harder problem, but it absolutely can be managed. And so 100% a kind of Green New Deal type of vision that involves lots of investment, hopefully public investment, in renewable energy and industries that are tied to renewable energy, including manufacturing the equipment that's used in renewable energy industries, and then building industries that can be fueled by the cheap, reliable power that's going to come from renewable energies. Those are all going to play an important role in rebuilding a stronger future of work, no doubt about it.
Another question that's come from members is around, you mentioned the universal basic income and the CERB being a rather stark and forceful introduction to that concept. And again, progressives will have to fight for it, but do you think that there's a greater likelihood that a fundamental measure like that has a greater likelihood of succeeding now, in part because of the pandemic and the flaws that it's revealed?
We did have a kind of a natural experiment, didn't we, in basic income? It wasn't a perfect basic income, but it had many features of a basic income. The CERB, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, was $2,000 a month flat rate. It wasn't tied to your income ahead of time. If you qualified, you got the $2,000, and it was made available to almost anyone who had been working, not just in sort of regular full-time jobs, but part-time jobs, self-employed, even gig workers could get it. You just had to show that you had made at least $5,000 in income the previous year. So, again, it wasn't universal, but it was a lot better than the former EI system, which was, had so many holes in it. Most Canadians fell through it. Most unemployed people couldn't qualify for $1 of EI benefits, which shows you how bad things had become. And that's why the government had to move. They knew, look, if this many Canadians, 3 million Canadians lost their jobs in the first weeks of the pandemic, and if they were forced to turn to EI, then we'd all be out in the streets. So they implemented this new system, and they implemented it quickly, and it did a fabulous job. Again, lots of issues in rolling it out, and not everyone was covered, but most people who needed it got it. And the world didn't end. So in a way, that was an interesting experiment that something like a universal basic income is feasible and could be done. Now, they've already phased out the CERB and gone back to the EI model, but an improved EI model, a vastly improved EI model. So that's a big step in the right direction. And I think the experience with the CERB, in a way, does make it more feasible to fight for a basic income for both economic and political reasons. For economic reasons, we showed that it can be done. For political reasons, we had a situation where there were 9 million Canadians who at one point or another in the pandemic were getting the CERB. And then that means that a huge number of Canadians understand why government support, why income support is needed at some point in your life. And the old divide and conquer rhetoric of trying to portray people on income supports as a lazy, coddled minority, vilifying them, that strategy, I think, isn't going to be feasible for some time now, because most Canadians understand, there are times in your life when you need income support, and actually we're better off as a society if we give it to people. The other thing that the CERB did that was interesting was it did put some pressure on employers who started complaining right away, particularly employers in the retail and hospitality sector, who not only pay minimum wage in their jobs, but also offer the most precarious schedules. So a few hours here, a few hours there. It was the hours that were as much a problem as the wage itself. And they were complaining immediately, look, people won't come to their jobs anymore because they can get CERB. Well, think about it. If you can get CERB, it's not like you were rich on CERB, $2,000 a month. But that could be quite a bit better than minimum wage, a few hours here, a few hours there, plus throw in the danger of getting on a bus, riding to your job,
the health risk,
possibly confronting COVID in the job, and then riding the bus home. Who wants to do that? And it would force employers to lift their offer, if you like, in terms of both income, but also hours and stability. And in that regard, I think there's a lot of potential. I don't think we'll get a one-size-fits-all basic income out of this, but I think we can use the lessons learned to move in that direction, as we've already done in the new EI system.
Right. Are there, you were talking about daycare before, a major uh, impact and revelation, the fact that women couldn't participate in the labor force. And again, daycare seems to have come to the front as a distinct possibility, even nationally now. Other than that, for women and say for youth, Jim, are there lessons for us coming out of COVID, or just in terms of your view of the future of work for those particular groups?
The COVID pandemic, in a way, was just absolutely unforgiving in how unfair it was. And this is just one of those things where you just shake your head. It was very unfair in terms of who caught COVID, and we're gathering more data and understanding how incredibly concentrated it is among disadvantaged communities, low-income communities, people of color, people in precarious jobs. There's an incredible correlation between actually catching COVID and what type of work you did. Right. And when you think about it, well, I guess that makes sense. Professionals and managers, they were doing their jobs. They've got their office. They could take their work home. They could continue making money without even having to leave the house. That's not true for most people. So it was very unfair that way. It was very unfair in its economic impacts. Young people lost jobs at twice the rate of the rest of us. Women lost jobs at a faster rate. Again, people in precarious jobs lost their work at twice the rate of the overall labor market. That one's a no-brainer. The whole point of a precarious position is to allow the employer to get rid of you when they don't need you. So that's exactly what happened. In that regard, precarious work did what it was intended to do. But that still meant that the economic as well as the health consequences of the pandemic incredibly concentrated among those who could least afford it. And then, for some of us, for the high income groups in Canada, their income was not affected. And for the ultra high income, the investors and people who own companies that did well, they've actually been enriched by the pandemic. So honestly, this whole experience is infuriating in how unfair that it has been. So for young people, for women, for workers of color, clearly we're going to need focused, aggressive efforts to support their survival through the current moment and support their re-engagement and re-employment as the economy rebuilds. And this is, again, another reason why I think it's going to take 3 or 5 or more years of a sort of deliberate reconstruction effort to get us back anywhere near to full potential. And those efforts should be concentrated and targeted on the people who need it the most. I'm thinking about young workers, for example. They're always, Gary, they're always the last hired and the first fired. That is just the experience for young people, and it's going to be true this time again. They were the first fired. They're going to be the last hired. And if you're, a person graduating from school or college or university right now, your entire lifetime career trajectory is going to be scarred by this experience. That's the reality. So we need targeted measures to hire young people as quickly as we can coming out of this, and, including things like, some kind of youth employment programs or even a youth employment guarantee. The governments could absolutely say, we're gonna reward young people. Remember, it's not young people who are most at health risk. It was the older people who were most at health risk. So we asked young people to stop what they were doing, and I know there was lots of, social commentary about young people who still went out and partied and so on. But on the whole, young people heard the call and undertook a big sacrifice to help their elders stay alive. And I'd like to recognize that with a youth guarantee to say, everyone who graduates in this 5-year window is going to get free tuition or a startup grant to start a small business or, 24 months of employment in a community works project, kind of like the community works projects that we ran in the 1930s. Right. Some way to pay back young people for the sacrifices they're making, but also support them in the transition towards reconstruction that we're going to be working on for years to come.
So you started out by saying, Jim, in terms of the future of work, the mythology, some of the hype. But the basic point you were making, work is just inherently part of being a human being. It's part of our this is who we are. This is how our civilizations work. The issues that COVID has laid bare, the inequalities, the unfairness, it's ever been thus. And so the policies you're talking about, COVID sort of really drove home, made obvious those inequalities. They reinforced them, made it even more obvious to us. But the policies that you're talking about and which you've fought for your entire professional life and others, it's still the same fight. It's still in many ways the same things that we're going to be fighting for before and after COVID. Are you, just to maybe get a little bit off, everything's connected, but the huge deficits that government is running up everywhere throughout the world, the debt load. Can you just briefly give us your view of, as you mentioned, the C.D. Howe institutes will be gearing up at some point, pointing to that as, okay, this is why we need to, cut back those policies and programs that try to address inequality. Can you, what's your response to that? And I'm sure it's probably the same response as pre-COVID, but walk us through, as an economist, are you really seriously concerned about the deficits and the debts we're running up? Or do you think, as with the world wars, this governments intervene when they have to, and we get through it. We pay them off, and we enter into periods of prosperity and growth if we approach it in the right way. But should we be really concerned about the level of debt and deficits we're incurring now?
Short answer, Gary, no. And we've done quite a bit of number crunching on that very point. Just recently, for example, Federal Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland issued the first real fiscal snapshot for the federal government after COVID hit, because we didn't have a budget. We didn't have a federal budget this year. So she brought down her fiscal and economic statement, and eye-watering numbers in there that generated all the headlines. A forecast federal deficit of $381 billion. So, obviously something we never ever would have contemplated before this. Provincially, the deficits are also larger than they've ever been. And frankly, the provinces have a harder time managing than the feds do. The feds have lots of ammunition at their disposal. The provinces, I think face a bit of a tougher run, but even there, it's not something to stay awake at night over. Various reasons why it doesn't matter. Number one, interest rates are almost at zero. Yeah. They had been falling for years and years before the pandemic, and then fell again with the pandemic. So the interest rate on 10-year federal government bonds is less than 1%. So, you could do almost anything with it and still make money. In fact, after inflation, it's negative. So that means in real terms, the government's going to pay back less than they borrowed, which literally means the more you borrow, the more you make. Secondly, the Bank of Canada now finally has joined other central banks around the world who've been doing this for years. And this year, the Bank of Canada is now engaging in what's called quantitative easing, which means they use the money creation power in their institution to basically create money to buy financial assets. And the financial assets they're buying are government bonds. So the bank has been buying $4 to $5 billion a week in government bonds, either directly from the government or indirectly from other financial investors who bought the bonds when they were initially issued. And that's important because it first of all keeps those interest rates very low. Secondly, it's our bank that's providing the money, so we're borrowing it from ourselves. So again, what's the big hairy deal? So the funny thing is, the government's actually going to spend less. The federal government is going to spend $4 billion less. Once upon a time, $4 billion was a large number. Not anymore, of course, but $4 billion less on interest costs this year than they budgeted in the previous budget. even though the deficit has exploded because interest rates have fallen almost to zero. So as long as we keep interest rates low and continue to use our own public bank to do a good chunk of the financing, it's not a problem. In fact, I would like to see the Bank of Canada commit to a broader and longer lasting program. I would like to see them, they're already buying provincial government bonds, and they should do more of that. That'll be one of the ways to help the provinces who have the tougher fiscal situation. I'd like to see them buy municipal bonds, because city governments are also in the tighter fiscal grip, and commit to maintaining that. In Japan, here's an interesting story. They started doing this in the early 90s in Japan after their big real estate meltdown over there. And today the government debt is 250% of GDP. That's several times higher than ours. And it's no crisis, and it hasn't inhibited the government in Japan from mobilizing big resources to fight COVID. In fact, the Japanese response to the pandemic has been one of the biggest and most effective anywhere in the world. So the evidence is accumulating that you can use public debt not as something to avoid at all costs, but actually as a tool to facilitate the sorts of investments and services that we're going to need. This is not going to stop the other side, though. This is why we've got to mobilize these arguments. The other side is going to come out saying the sky is falling, the sky is falling. We're going to have a debt crisis. We're going to hit the debt wall. We're already starting to hear those arguments. So part of responding to that is learning what's wrong with their arguments. And part of it is just saying, I don't care what you think about the deficit. I still want good health care. I still want national child care. I still demand these other public services that are essential to my life. And at the end of the day, it's going to be the fierce demands of Canadians for those essential services, those essential public services and social infrastructure that wins the day more than the economic arguments. You know, that's a hard thing for an economist to admit, that it's not the economic arguments, it's political power that will determine it at the end of the day. But that is the reality.
So politics, my favorite subject. And I mean, this does suggest to me that progressive parties at this time, as you put it before, there's an opportunity here, like the COVID in a way. And I've heard the same thing around the climate issue. If we can mobilize resources like we have during world wars and for COVID, why cannot we mobilize those resources to address inequality, to address climate change? And so there is an opportunity here, but while economists may not save the day, that ultimately it has to be translated into political action, it's analysts like you that help politicians bridge the gap between connect with ordinary people, voters, right, to make the point that if government plays a stronger role, if we can deal with these inequality issues, not just make your life better off, but everyone is better off if we can address inequality. Everybody will be better off if we can address climate change. But it's analysts like you and the work you do day to day that's what enables. And I have been a politician, not a particularly successful one, but it does help politicians make those arguments with voters, with average citizens, who of course are concerned most about their families and their lives. But they, as you pointed out, the nature of being human is that you see beyond just your selfish interests, and it's the work that you do, Jim, that helps politicians make the case for a more progressive approach to economics and governance in Canada. So this has been a real honor for me again, and we could go on and on. I hope people enjoy this, and thanks so much for taking the time, spending the time, and all the best with your future work. We'll look forward to hearing more from from you and from your group in making the case for a better world. Now I am sounding like a politician, but thanks so much, Jim.
Gary, thank you. And thank you to your colleagues on Salt Spring Island there for what you're doing to make a better world on that island and everywhere else. And I look forward to staying in touch with you.
Great.